If you had been standing outside that school, you would have sworn everyone inside had already fled. The windows were dark. The streets were silent. The war was almost over. But one sound refused to disappear. Children's voices. Why would anyone still be teaching when an entire town was running for its life? Why would a woman lock herself inside a building everyone else had abandoned? And why, when American soldiers finally reached the front gate, did the officer leading them lower his weapon instead of giving an order? What he found behind those brick walls would stay with him for the rest of his life, not because of what he saw, but because of what one ordinary schoolteacher quietly refused to do. Spring 1945. The morning air carried the damp scent of broken masonry, wet earth, and smoke drifting from distant neighborhoods where chimneys no longer stood straight. Across the narrow streets of a small German town, doors hung open as families hurried away with whatever they could carry. A baby carriage rolled unattended until it rested against a stone curb. Laundry still fluttered from clotheslines, forgotten beneath a sky that felt impossibly calm for a country coming apart. Inside the town's elementary school, however, another world continued to exist. The bell had not rung that morning. There was no electricity left to power it. Yet 27 children sat quietly in a basement classroom illuminated only by oil lamps whose soft glow danced across worn wooden desks. Some of the children still clutched schoolbooks. Others held threadbare dolls or blankets that had become more valuable than toys. Their whispers blended with the scratch of chalk moving steadily across an old blackboard. Anna Keller finished writing the final arithmetic problem before placing the chalk down with deliberate care. She looked at each small face, not counting numbers this time, but making certain every child was still there. 27. She silently repeated every name she had memorized long before the war had reached their streets. Some parents had promised they would return before sunset. Others had disappeared weeks earlier. A few children already understood they would never see home again, though none of them spoke those fears aloud. Anna folded the attendance book against her chest, as if it contained something far more precious than names and dates. Above them, another distant rumble drifted through the aging brick walls. Dust floated gently from the ceiling beams. A little girl near the front looked up without saying a word. Anna offered only the smallest smile, the kind adults where when they hope confidence can be borrowed. Then she opened a weathered storybook, took one slow breath, and began reading as though the world outside could wait just a few more pages. Anna read slowly, never rushing the words, allowing each sentence to settle over the room like a warm blanket. The story itself hardly mattered anymore. It was the sound of a calm voice that held the children together. Outside, uncertainty belonged to the streets. Inside, every page she turned reminded them that order still existed somewhere. When she reached the final line, she closed the book gently instead of snapping it shut. The silence that followed was peaceful rather than fearful. A small boy named Lucas raised his hand exactly as he would have before the war. "Will school be open tomorrow?" he asked. Several children looked toward Anna before anyone else breathed. It was the kind of question only a child could ask, carrying hope without realizing how fragile it had become. Anna smiled, although the answer weighed heavily inside her. "Tomorrow," she said softly, "we will do what we always do. We will stay together." No one questioned her. They had learned that her promises were never careless. Weeks earlier, when food had become scarce, she had quietly divided every loaf into smaller pieces, so every child received something. When a cellar had grown cold at night, she had gathered abandoned blankets from empty houses one by one, never telling anyone how many miles she had walked. When frightened children woke from nightmares, she remained awake beside them until sunrise, pretending she had not been tired at all. The attendance book resting beside her had become far more than a school record. Every morning, she checked every name. Every evening, she checked them again. 27 names. 27 responsibilities. She refused to let even one disappear unnoticed into the confusion surrounding them. Upstairs, the old building answered the wind with slow creaks that echoed through empty hallways. Dust drifted across framed maps and forgotten lesson plans, still hanging neatly on classroom walls. The world beyond those windows had stopped making sense, but inside the school Anna insisted that desks remain straight, hands were washed before meals, and every child said thank you before receiving food. Routine became a form of shelter stronger than brick walls. Late that afternoon, an elderly woman from a nearby house carefully opened the basement door, carrying a small basket covered with a linen towel. Inside rested 6 boiled potatoes and 2 jars of preserved carrots. "It is everything I have left," she whispered apologetically. Anna looked at the basket, then at the children watching quietly from their seats. She thanked the woman with genuine warmth before immediately reaching for a knife. 27 portions would not be large, but they would be equal. She had made that decision long ago. No child would ever believe another life mattered more than their own while they remained under her care. The potatoes disappeared more slowly than anyone expected. Every child waited until the person beside them had received a piece before taking the first bite. Anna watched without saying a word. Months of quiet example had taught lessons no textbook ever could. Gratitude did not require speeches. Kindness did not require abundance. When the simple meal ended, she carefully folded the empty linen towel and placed it beside the attendance book, making a silent promise to return it if she ever found the woman again. Above the basement, daylight began fading into the pale gray of early evening. The streets outside remained strangely still. No wagons rolled across the square. No church bell marked the hour. Even the birds seemed to have abandoned the rooftops. Anna climbed the narrow staircase alone, stopping halfway to listen. She had become skilled at recognizing ordinary sounds from unusual ones. A loose shutter tapping against brick. Wind moving through broken gutters. Footsteps on old cobblestones. Tonight, she heard something different. It came from far beyond the town, low and steady, almost like distant thunder that refused to fade. She stepped into the empty hallway and walked toward the front entrance. Through the narrow glass panel beside the door, she looked across the deserted street. Nothing moved except scraps of paper drifting along the curb. Yet the distant rumble continued, growing clearer with every passing minute. She quietly locked the front door again before returning downstairs. The children immediately looked up from their desks. They searched her face for answers she did not yet have. Anna simply picked up a geography map from the shelf and unrolled it across the largest table. "Who remembers where the Mississippi River begins?" she asked with gentle confidence. Several hands rose at once. The lesson continued as naturally as any ordinary school day. Miles away, Captain James Carter sat inside an American command vehicle studying a weathered paper map spread across his knees. His unit had spent the afternoon moving through villages where houses stood abandoned and schools had already emptied. Their newest assignment seemed routine. Confirm that the remaining civilians had evacuated the next town before nightfall and prepare safe routes for families still trapped by damaged roads. James traced the road with one finger until it stopped beside a small schoolhouse marked only by a faded ink square. According to the latest report, the building should have been empty. Still, one sentence scribbled in the margin caught his attention. Possible civilian activity after evacuation. Verify before dawn. James folded the map carefully and slipped it into his jacket pocket. Outside, engines settled into a quiet idle as evening shadows stretched across the road. Within the hour, his convoy began moving toward the town, unaware that 27 children and one determined teacher were still waiting behind a locked basement door. The convoy entered the town just as the last light slipped behind the rooftops. Captain James Carter studied the empty streets through the windshield, noticing details that did not belong together. Store signs still hung neatly above their doors. Flower boxes rested beneath several windows. A bicycle leaned against a stone wall, as though its owner had intended to return only minutes later. Everything suggested ordinary life, yet not a single person appeared. His driver slowed as they passed the town square. "Feels like somebody pressed pause," one soldier murmured quietly. James did not answer. His attention had already settled on the school, standing at the far end of the street. Unlike the surrounding buildings, one basement window glowed faintly with warm yellow light. It was almost invisible against the gathering darkness, but once he noticed it, he could not look away. He stepped out of the vehicle, the evening air cool against his face, carrying the familiar scent of damp stone and spring soil. Somewhere nearby, a loose metal sign creaked softly in the breeze. Otherwise, the town remained silent. James signaled for the rest of the unit to stay behind while he walked the final 100 feet alone. Every report had insisted the school was empty. Yet someone had lit those lamps. Standing outside the heavy wooden entrance, he listened. At first he heard nothing. Then, almost too quietly to believe, came the sound of a woman reading aloud. The words were German, but the rhythm needed no translation. It was the gentle pace of someone telling a bedtime story. A child's laughter followed, brief and completely unafraid. James frowned. He knocked firmly against the old door. The reading stopped instantly. Silence settled over the building once again. Several long seconds passed before careful footsteps approached from inside. A key turned slowly in the lock, but the door opened only a few inches. Anna Keller stood before him, holding an oil lamp whose warm light softened the exhaustion on her face. Neither of them spoke immediately. James had expected fear, confusion, perhaps anger. Instead, he found remarkable composure. Her shoulders remained steady. Her voice, when she finally spoke, carried the calm confidence of someone introducing herself to a parent rather than confronting a foreign officer. "Good evening," she said in careful English. "The children are resting." James glanced beyond her shoulder into the dim hallway, where tiny pairs of shoes had been lined neatly against the wall. There were more than he could count at first glance. No signs of panic. No hiripacking. Only order. He looked back at Anna, lowering his voice almost instinctively. "How many children are inside?" She answered without hesitation, as though she had repeated the number to herself all day. 27, she said. "Every one of them is still here." James remained at the doorway for another moment, letting the number settle in his mind. 27. Not a family. Not a handful of frightened children. An entire classroom. He glanced toward the quiet street behind him before meeting Anna's eyes again. "You need to leave tonight," he said calmly. "We have transportation. We can move everyone before sunrise." Anna listened without interrupting. When he finished, she lowered the oil lamp slightly and looked back toward the basement stairs. The faint sound of children whispering drifted upward once more. Only then did she answer. "Not yet." James assumed she had misunderstood his English. "It is not safe for you to stay here." "I know," she replied. "That is not why we are staying." He waited for an explanation, but none came. Instead, Anna stepped aside just enough for him to see into the hallway. Small coats hung neatly on wooden hooks. Shoes rested in perfect rows beneath them. A chalk drawing of flowers still decorated one wall, untouched by everything happening beyond the school grounds. Nothing about the building suggested chaos. It looked as though tomorrow's lessons were already waiting. James removed his cap without realizing he had done so. "Miss Keller," he said carefully, "my orders are to evacuate every civilian we find." Anna nodded once. "Then we share the same responsibility." Her answer caught him off guard. "The difference is that mine began before yours." Neither voice rose. Neither challenged the other. The conversation unfolded with quiet certainty, as though both understood duty better than argument. James finally asked the question that had been growing in his mind since she opened the door. "Why did you not leave when everyone else did?" Anna rested one hand on the attendance book she had been carrying all evening. The worn leather cover showed years of careful use. "Because 27 children came to school expecting their teacher to be here," she said softly. "Some have no parents left to return for them. Some still believe they will walk through that door tomorrow. Until I know every child has somewhere safe to go, this is where I belong." The words carried no anger, no attempt to impress him. They sounded like a simple fact she had accepted long ago. James looked down at the attendance book. Its corners were worn smooth from years of being opened every morning. He suddenly understood why she had answered his first question so quickly. She did not remember the number because she was counting students. She remembered because she carried every name with her. Behind him, one of his sergeants approached quietly and stopped several feet away. "Captain," he said in a low voice, "the trucks are ready whenever you give the order." James did not answer immediately. His eyes remained on the teacher standing before him, still holding the lamp in one hand and the attendance book in the other. For the first time that evening, he realized he was not trying to persuade a frightened civilian. He was standing in front of someone who had already made her decision long before he ever arrived. James drew a slow breath before turning toward the soldiers waiting near the gate. "We are changing the plan," he said. "No one rushes anyone. We move the children first, one at a time." The men exchanged quick glances, then nodded without question. Something in their captain's voice made it clear that this was no ordinary evacuation. Within minutes, blankets, canteens, and lanterns were being carried toward the school instead of military equipment. One corporal removed his heavy field jacket and draped it over the shoulders of the youngest child before they even stepped outside. Another found a wooden crate and placed it beside the entrance so smaller children could climb into the truck more easily. Anna watched every gesture carefully, her expression unchanged, but the tension around her eyes softened for the first time that evening. She opened the attendance book once more. "Lucas," she called gently. The little boy stood, picked up his school bag, and walked toward the door without speaking. Before he reached the stairs, Anna knelt to straighten the collar of his worn sweater. "Remember what we practiced?" she whispered. "Stay with the group." He nodded with complete trust. James waited outside until the boy stepped into the cool night air. Only then did he offer his hand. Lucas hesitated for barely a second before placing his small fingers into the captain's open palm. Together, they crossed the quiet street. One child safely aboard. Anna marked a small line beside his name. Then she called another. The rhythm continued. A girl carrying a patched cloth rabbit. Two brothers who insisted on walking side by side. A quiet child with oversized glasses who carefully tucked a geography notebook beneath one arm before leaving. Every student carried something almost weightless, yet impossible to replace. Every student heard Anna repeat the same words before stepping outside. "Stay together. Look ahead. I will be right behind you." No promise sounded more certain. The soldiers gradually stopped speaking among themselves. Instead, they waited patiently as each child crossed from the school to the waiting trucks. One by one, they accepted tiny hands, lifted small bags, adjusted blankets, and offered reassuring smiles that needed no common language. James noticed that Anna never looked toward the vehicles until each child had climbed aboard safely. Her eyes remained fixed only on the next name waiting in the attendance book. Nearly an hour passed before the basement finally grew quiet. Empty desks stood beneath the warm glow of the remaining oil lamps. Chalk still rested on the blackboard ledge beside unfinished arithmetic problems. Anna slowly closed the attendance book after marking another careful line. 26 names now carried the same small mark. She looked around the room once more, then paused. One space on the page remained untouched. One child had not answered when called. Without a word, she reopened the book and ran her finger gently beneath the final name. Anna stared at the final name for several long seconds. Emil Bauer, 8 years old, quiet, curious, always the first to return borrowed books to the classroom shelf. She closed the attendance book without another word and turned toward the basement stairs. James immediately recognized the look on her face. "Who was missing?" he asked. "Emil," she answered. "He was here this afternoon." She looked toward the empty classroom, her eyes moving from desk to desk until they rested on one small chair near the back wall. A knitted scarf still hung across its wooden backrest. "He asked if he could look for his grandfather before supper," she said quietly. "I told him to stay inside." I believed he had. There was no panic in her voice, only the heavy realization that certainty had disappeared. James motioned for 2 soldiers to bring lanterns. "We will help you find him." Anna shook her head gently. "No, the other children need to keep seeing calm faces." James understood immediately. If 26 frightened children watched every soldier scatter into the darkness, fear would spread faster than reassurance. He turned to one of his sergeants. "Stay with the trucks. Keep everyone warm. Tell them their teacher will be back soon." The sergeant nodded without hesitation. Moments later, only James and Anna walked into the nearly silent streets, carrying lanterns whose circles of light drifted slowly across worn cobblestones. Every doorway seemed to hide another shadow. Every abandoned garden whispered with the sound of leaves moving in the evening breeze. They searched methodically, calling Emil's name in voices that remained steady instead of desperate. Anna stopped outside the public library, its front windows dark behind layers of dust. "He loved this place," she said softly. "Every Wednesday he borrowed books about rivers and trains." The door stood slightly open. James pushed it carefully with one hand. Inside, rows of shelves stretched through the darkness. Their lantern light revealed floating dust and scattered pages lying across the wooden floor. Nothing else moved. Then Anna smiled almost imperceptibly. She did not hear footsteps. She heard humming. It was faint, uneven, but unmistakable. A simple tune she taught every Friday before classes ended. She followed the sound toward the children's reading corner at the back of the library. Curled beneath a small table, wrapped inside an oversized winter coat, sat Emil. A picture book rested open across his knees. He looked up with sleepy eyes, blinking against the lantern light. "Miss Keller," he whispered with complete relief, as though he had never doubted she would come. Anna knelt beside him and gently brushed the dust from his sleeve. "Everyone has been waiting for you," she said with a warm smile. Emil glanced toward James, then back at his teacher. "I knew you would remember my name," he said. James lowered his eyes for a moment, suddenly understanding that the attendance book had never simply been a list. For Anna, every name inside it was a promise. Anna took Emil's hand, and together the three of them stepped back into the cool night. The little boy held his picture book tightly against his chest, as though it had been the reason he felt brave enough to wait. James carried the lantern a few feet ahead, its warm circle of light stretching across the quiet street toward the school where the last truck still waited with its engine humming softly. As they approached, 26 small faces immediately turned toward the road. No one spoke. Then Lucas suddenly smiled. "Emil is back," he whispered, and the words traveled through the group like the first warm breeze after a long winter. Several children waved from beneath their blankets. Emil waved back with his free hand, looking embarrassed by the attention. Anna led him to the truck, but did not help him climb aboard immediately. Instead, she reopened the attendance book beneath the lantern light. The pages fluttered gently in the evening breeze before stopping on the familiar list of names. James watched as she placed one finger beneath the final line. Emil Bauer. Slowly, carefully, she drew the last small mark beside his name. 27 lines. 27 children accounted for. She closed the book with both hands and released a quiet breath she had been holding far longer than anyone realized. Only then did she nod toward Emil. "Go ahead," she said softly. The boy climbed into the truck where the other children welcomed him with tired smiles and gentle pats on the shoulder. James looked around the vehicle, silently counting the rows of faces. Every seat was filled. Every blanket covered another child, now safe together. He stepped down and walked back toward Anna, who remained standing beside the empty school. "Now it is your turn," he said. She did not move immediately. Instead, she turned once more toward the old brick building. The windows reflected only darkness now. The oil lamps had been extinguished. The classrooms where multiplication tables, poems, and geography lessons had once filled ordinary mornings stood silent behind locked doors. Anna removed the small brass key from her coat pocket and held it in her palm for a moment before placing it carefully inside the attendance book. It belonged with the school until someone could open those classrooms again. Without another word, she walked to the truck. James offered his hand exactly as he had done for every child that evening. Anna accepted it with quiet gratitude and climbed aboard. As the convoy slowly pulled away, she looked back through the rear canvas opening. The school grew smaller with every passing yard until it became only another shadow among many. Yet the attendance book resting gently on her lap felt heavier than ever, not because it contained names, but because every promise written inside it had been kept. Many years later, the town looked different. The broken walls had been rebuilt. New trees lined the sidewalks where empty streets had once echoed with silence. Children once again hurried through school doors carrying backpacks instead of blankets. Morning bells rang across the neighborhood with the ordinary confidence of peace. Inside a bright classroom filled with sunlight, a gray-haired man placed an old leather attendance book carefully on his desk. The students gathered around it with quiet curiosity. Its corners were worn smooth. Its pages had yellowed with age. Across the front cover, there was no medal, no decoration, no title announcing greatness. It looked like the kind of school record that thousands of teachers had carried over the years. The man smiled gently before opening it to a single page preserved beneath a sheet of clear paper. 27 names appeared in neat handwriting. Beside every name rested one careful mark. Nothing more. "My name is Emil Bauer," he said. "This was my classroom before I was old enough to understand what courage looked like." The children leaned closer. They expected a story about soldiers, battles, or dramatic escapes. Instead, Emil spoke about arithmetic lessons, shared potatoes, borrowed library books, and a teacher who insisted that every child say thank you even when there was almost nothing left to give. He remembered how she straightened collars before opening classroom doors, how she smiled first whenever fear entered the room, how she never counted children as numbers but always called them by name. "I thought every teacher knew every student that way," he admitted softly. "It took me many years to realize how rare that truly was." After class, one young girl remained behind. She looked at the old attendance book before asking a simple question. "Did she save all of you?" Emil closed the book slowly and rested one hand across its cover. "No," he answered with a quiet smile. "She reminded us that we were worth saving. That changed the rest of our lives." Across the ocean, Captain James Carter also carried one memory from that spring evening. He never spoke often about the war. Yet whenever someone asked him what courage looked like, he never described uniforms, orders, or victories. He described a quiet hallway, neatly lined shoes, an oil lamp glowing in gentle hands, and a woman who refused to stop being a teacher even when the world around her had forgotten how to be ordinary. History often remembers those who gave commands. It sometimes remembers those who changed the course of nations. But every so often, history quietly preserves someone whose greatest act was simply refusing to leave another human being behind. She never asked to become extraordinary. She simply remained faithful to 27 names written on one worn page. And in doing so, she quietly raised the standard for everyone who came after her.